Now, I bet everyone here recognizes the accelerating rate of change, probably read materials along those lines. And that is something that has been true since the dawn of life on Earth, 4.5 billion years. You can say each evolutionary step was faster and faster. More recently, technological change has moved at a faster rate, and economic growth has also moved at accelerating rates of progress. That was not relevant to probably any humans in the 19th century and most of the 20th century. But now we're reaching a point where not being aware of the accelerating rate of change has tangible opportunity costs for people. A lot of the people who do understand this are perhaps seeing opportunities as tech entrepreneurs elsewhere that others don't see. So it is extremely important to be aware of the accelerating rate of change, and it's a great time for us to be alive. In some ways, you could say 1 year of our life is like 20 years of the lives of people who lived in the 18th century. And you'll see many changes that way. But within the accelerating rate of change, there's one subcomponent that is very, very under-discussed. And in the 15 years I've been reading about this and thinking about it, I can think of no subject anywhere of any type that affects more people more completely and yet has so little written about it, which is what we're going to get to in the next slide. It's the economic trajectory under accelerating change. I've seen only 5 people, including myself, who've written substantial things about this. Most of those are over 10 years old. But the accelerating rate of economic change is definitely for real, even if we don't feel it, as I'm about to show you through some data. Now, this might be kind of dim, but this is from the Google GDP. If you do a Google search for GDP, you can get this data. These are the same 2 charts. One is on a linear scale above, and the bottom one is on a logarithmic scale. It starts, if you can see, 1960 to present. World GDP per capita, it's in that accelerating parabola. And just to prove that it is in fact at that accelerating exponential curve, we see it as a straight line in the logarithmic curve. Now, this is 1960 until 2015, most recent year of data. Throughout the hardships of this period, you see certain ebbs and flows. This is always a US dollar metric. But it always kind of reverts back to its trend line. And when we are below trend line, that's when you can expect, okay, at some point there's going to be a reversion back to the trend line, and so on. But what happens if we go back before 1960? The data that has been gathered about GDP going back 500 years, it shows an exponential trend in that way as well. And thus very, very little growth until, say, the 15th century, then minimal growth until the 18th century, much less than 1% a year. 19th century, maybe exceeding 1% a year. But only by the second half of the 20th century was 3% a year the trend line. We think that's normal, but that did not exist for the vast majority of human existence. Now, we can make an argument GDP is not the best metric because it doesn't necessarily capture the full effect of technology, but for the time being, that's what we have. So GDP per capita is what we do. Going to this other chart, now you can see on the vertical axis, it's a logarithmic scale, GDP per capita. And the horizontal axis is a little bit complicated. You can see we started the present, year 0, and we go backwards, years ago from 2050, if we projected the same linear regression trend to 2050. So today, if we're 2016, you can see where we are, roughly 11,000 per capita. Just continuation of a trend that's existed for many centuries puts us to a very high number by 2050, so just 33 years away. And this parabola has never, ever changed. Even if you took a different point, the shape of it would be the same. And we get to, you see, year 1500, year 1950, very little change. 2000, 2015, now things are accelerating just along that trend line. Another way to look at it is, what if I told you that all the economic growth that has ever occurred has happened after 1998? That is really something to think about in terms of the accelerating rate of change and how the trajectory that we're on is getting steeper and steeper in this regard. To show how steep that is, the next chart over here, which is very similar, just extends the horizontal axis much further back. Years ago, from 2050, along the same regression. You go all the way back to 2,000 years before 2050, so year zero, and so on. We are already on this very steep curve, and just getting a little bit steeper, vertical axis being logarithmic, we get to very, very high per capita GDP even in 2050. Most of us will still be alive at that time. And that is where there isn't enough realization of how this trajectory is, and a lot of the policies that we have are not well structured for this type of reality. We still think linearly. Now, part of the problem, though, is because our policies are in some way not letting the natural trends manifest, we actually see that GDP is sluggish, at least in the United States and other Western countries. And why is it drifting lower? Why do we have what used to be 3% real GDP going to 2%, as well as lower inflation? So nominal GDP growth without inflation adjustment from 7 to 4. And we're going to examine why that is and what policy recommendations may be able to fix that. But when you get to this trend line, you see kind of where we are and what sort of expectation can be had for the relatively near future. As far as geographically, why we don't necessarily see that in the United States, but we see high growth in certain other countries. This chart from the McKinsey Institute, most of the people interested in this chart are interested in a certain topic, where the world center of GDP was for many centuries and how it's reverting back to that. From a business perspective, yeah, one can say, okay, all the net dollars created, most of which are going to be in Asia. But I think this chart has an even bigger takeaway, is look how short of a time it takes for the more recent jumps to occur. It took many centuries to go from the year zero to just like have slight movement, 1,500 years, and now within just a decade or two, you get to very, very rapid movement. So we know that places like China, India grow 6 or 7% real GDP per year. But look at the speed at which things change just within the flow of the trend line that we saw before. Now, that being said, our current policies are kind of suffocating the natural growth, so we are slightly below the trend line. And what would ultimately make us snap back? So, observing technological disruptions. Everyone over here probably observes them very, very well, but a lot of people don't necessarily see how many are going on. One or two that are obvious might be visible. We upgrade our smartphone or something like that. There's many, many other ones that are underway to help us understand how these disruptions are all at varying stages of progress from what we're seeing. So think about what you have at home and how many devices or products that kind of depreciate at a Moore's Law type rate. And the number is probably higher than a lot of people think. So it's not only that the laptop computer or something is more advanced than 20 years ago, you have more of them and more computational density and more devices. If you go to, say, the 1970s, there were none. By the 80s, you had maybe one or two, like an Atari console or something. By the 90s, more. And now most people, I have a poll in the publication online, and most people have 25 to 30 such devices. This is all of your cell phones, tablets, your PC, your game console. If you have a VR set, if you have a car, there's about $4,000 of electronics in even the average car. The television itself has been pulled into a Moore's Law type depreciation. Like for many years, we had just tube TVs. Now you have LED TVs that drop in price at a much faster rate. So it's also been tugged into that mega trend. And as we see these numbers rising, you see there's more points of technological deflation surrounding you in your home. Not only more computation per dollar, but more places that's occurred. And that's the second dimension that's not discussed. The amount of deflating technological force is much higher as a percentage of your spending and hence a percentage of GDP. For example, I would say in 1999, we were only 0.5% of GDP was comprised of products that were rapidly deflating. Chipsets, storage, software, and so on. By 2008, maybe 1%. By 2016, now it's 2%. 2% is large enough to cause certain distortions, as we'll see. one product example we're all familiar with, take something like the Apple iPod. First, the product didn't have any viability because you needed processing, storage, batteries, display, and music software all to be cheap enough to fit into a certain size. When that could work, we see a very rapid sales of the Apple iPod. And that goes on until 2009 or so. But then, look what happens. Sales go down. Why? It's not that there isn't a demand for that type of product that can perform a certain task. It's that now it doesn't have to be its own product. It's swallowed into the phone, and it comprises a certain percentage of your phone's capabilities. The smartphone has absorbed a lot of these different products and different nodes, not just a music player like the iPod, but the calculator, the GPS system, the alarm clock, and 10 other things. So even though the smartphone and other devices are consolidating more nodes into themselves, we still see this node rising phenomenon that we saw here. So despite the consolidation, you can see how many more devices are in the home that people use. This is also causing another paradox, because there's more things to upgrade, which costs more money, which then perhaps contracts technology demand, which we'll come to for a solution. So this type of chart, there's a great deal of beauty in a chart like this, just because you can see technological progress on both ends. A product comes into being because 4 or 5 components all become cheap enough, small enough, power efficient enough, until it becomes so efficient it doesn't even have to be its own product. It's just a component of your phone. This chart, I hope you can see the details here. It's just an adoption of technology speed chart, and that too for the US. I couldn't find one for the entire world, but that would indicate even steeper acceleration. You can see how the inventions from a century ago took 30 or 40 years to reach 50% penetration. But now everything new that comes out, penetration is just in a matter of years. Any major innovation consumer technology will reach 50% innovation in a few years. Like if VR goggles is a major innovation, we know it'll get to 50% market penetration in just a short time. And business models and valuations of companies working on that thus begin to reflect that. And it's an expected thing, even though we don't necessarily recognize how rapid of a disruption that is. If you invented something in the 18th century that was very, very useful at the time, you still couldn't get 50% penetration in a short time. It just could not happen. There wasn't the communication network, the distribution network, the ambient type of adoption norm that it would depend on. Now this accelerating adoption means things just happen very quickly, a great opportunity for entrepreneurs, but also very, very rapid. And that's how we get to this number that I mentioned. Now 2% of world GDP is within this rapidly disrupting and rapidly deflating technology. And that amount is exponential and not linear. So we went from 0.5 to 1 to 2, going from 2 to 4 will also take just the same number of years, 4 to 8. And the world will be a very different place, but that is not very, very far away. We could be there in just 15 or 16 years. More about how different types of disruption occur. This chart may look busy, but I'll explain what these are. We know about Moore's law for chipsets, but there's so many other things in addition to semiconductor chips that decline in price. The less appreciated one is storage, but that has fallen at even a faster rate than transistor density on chipsets. But very unrelated, on the upper left-hand side, Swanson's law for solar panels. These charts you can see larger in the publication itself. You see, both axes are logarithmic, so you have not only cost effectiveness of solar panels, but the adoption, cumulative gigawatts of solar panels shipped. And this has been a trend that's been going on for 30 years. And it's just reaching this tipping point, but that now solar is cheap enough to be widely deployed in the countries that can make the best use of solar, which are not northern countries, but countries in a tropical climate. And the cumulative amount of photovoltaics shipped is now very, very high. It's about 1 to 1.5% of all electricity generated now. It took decades to get to even 1%. But to go from 1% to 10% will take a much shorter time than you think. It'll take only 8 or 9 years before 10% of all world electricity consumption is through solar. Now, on the upper right-hand side, an entirely different technology, very unrelated, cost of genome sequencing. Yet it's still falling at a very, very rapidly deflating rate, much faster than Moore's law, and at a similar trajectory as solar. So something completely unrelated also at this exponentially deflating rate. And the bottom two charts are for a very unglamorous technology most people don't even notice, but it's very important, lighting, LEDs, and so on. You see not only lighting efficiency rising very quickly, but also the cost of a bulb falling. So there's a double exponential trend on LED efficiency. May not seem like a big deal, but this will save hundreds of billions of dollars in electricity costs, which are also inherent to what technology does. And one of the points of what I've written is that technology finds a way to lower costs of anything that is too expensive or too obstructing to the trend line. It will either find a way around it or topple it head on. We see this in disruptions through many business models. For example, Uber lowering the price of taxi medallions, or startups that are doing these online courses, lowering the cost of education from, and freeing that cost from the university and the associated costs of that. Now, that's why I come to the conclusion here that no industry is immune to technological disruption. Any obstructionist action merely makes disruption sharper at a later date because it has to revert to the trend line. There's no industry that's an exception to this, not even the governance industry, or we also call the government. It is called the public sector government and so on because we don't necessarily want to hold it to the same standards that we hold the private sector to, that you have to be competitive, you have to worry about disruption and so on. But technology doesn't care about that. So any industry that is obstructing the productivity gains inherent to technology will, in fact, court their own doom in the process, as we'll see. You can quantify the amount of disruption that's happening in the world at any given time. Technological disruptions are all interconnected with each other and self-reinforcing, even in a very different area. You may think that fracking technology that lowered the price of oil and natural gas in the United States has nothing to do with VR goggles and those improving rapidly, but they are connected because all technology is connected and mutually reinforcing disruption. That's why the title of this publication is called ATOM, ATOM, Accelerating Technonomic Medium. The fixed amount of disruption that is underway at any given time is measurable, is rising exponentially, and can be quantified. And as a result, you can kind of rank industries and products in terms of how overdue or due they are for disruption, and assess where something may be more due for disruption, may have erected barriers that are just too high to enable the disruption now, but cause a sharper disruption at a shortly later time. And in that vein, we get to what I call the overlooked economics of technology. In a lot of our government public policy, the right hand is not talking to the left because what we work on here in Silicon Valley isn't funneling back to what the public sector is thinking about. And that's starting to cause distortions that I mentioned. So the overlooked economics of technology are as follows. So shifting gears a little bit, and you'll see how it ties back in. This is world central bank action to date. In the United States, it's called quantitative easing. In other countries, something else. But there's no coordination between central banks. And I contend that the fact that we do so much QE and have not seen inflation is because technological deflation, the 2% of world GDP that's rapidly deflating, is in fact canceling out the expected inflation you would see from things like quantitative easing. And because technological progress is exponential, you will then see an exponentially rising amount of quantitative easing needed just to offset that. Now, no one central bank is anywhere near looking at this, but if you add up the total of all central banks of the world into a cumulative total, doesn't it look like that familiar parabolic curve that we often see in exponential change? To date, since 2009, the world has done $17 trillion of quantitative easing type programs and are doing $220 billion a month today as we speak, just to maintain the minimal amount of inflation that we see right now. And they keep having to increase this amount just to stay in place. The United States right now is not doing quantitative easing, but that illusion only exists because this is a worldwide combined metric, and the United States draws from the central bank easing that is done by Japan, Europe, and China, thereby creating the illusion that we're not doing QE. Now, central banks don't see it this way because they haven't looked at the big picture about how all of these actions are interconnected. When the United States did quantitative easing the first time in 2010, they thought it would be the only one, so they call it QE. Then the market corrected, and they had to do another one, so they call it QE2. They thought that was the last one. Then they had to do a third one that they call QE3, and they thought that was the last one, QE3. But I'm saying, no, this has to be permanent because you have to get past you have to offset the technological deflation that we see. Otherwise, you will have deflation in the economy, which our economy is not structured for. There's a lot of debt. And deflation is the most terrifying thing imaginable for someone who has student debt, mortgage loan debt, and so on. But if this reality is recognized for what it is, it can be a very, very good thing, as I'll explain. So if this exponential amount of QE is mandatory and has to be ever rising, what's the end game? We've already done 17 trillion, 220 billion a month. According to just the trend line, it would have to be 400 billion a month, then $1 trillion a month, then $2 trillion a month. What happens then? How can we be doing $2 trillion a month just to offset technological deflation? And the ideological barriers here are so many for the central bank is, one, they have to accept that QE is permanent. Two, they have to go to the legislative body, like in the US, only Congress can expand the powers of the Federal Reserve. And the same is true in other countries, and be able to do QE in a more diffuse way. What's done in the US is that all quantitative easing, the 4 trillion that the US has done out of the 17 trillion worldwide, is only in two asset classes, US treasuries and mortgage-backed securities. That has distorted those asset classes. Like, it makes government borrowing rates very low so that we spend more. It makes mortgage rates very low and boosts home prices over here, but just very narrowly concentrated dollars over there. You can't do it that narrowly anymore because, as you may have heard about in the financial media, it's called pushing on a string. So it has to be done in a way that is more diffuse and generates more velocity of money. We have a velocity of money freeze right now because we're keeping inflation way too low, barely at 0%, which is less of a tailwind for other business investment and so on. Like, we in the tech industry, everything's about the valuation of a startup or the PE ratio of a big company. And you tend to not get as good a valuation as you otherwise would if the GDP trend line is too low, because the valuation on the entire sector is lower than it otherwise might be. And that's the reason that we're going to have a problem very, very shortly, is because there was an accelerating rate of change in economic growth as we saw, our current policies are choking that by not creating enough velocity of money. Quantitative easing is too concentrated, and nominal GDP is too low. And that is why there's so much angst right now. Well, is technology taking away jobs? What are we going to do about that? What will people do? And can this be stopped? Leading to misguided approaches such as, well, let's ban certain technologies or obstruct certain technologies, which never, ever works. So about technology and jobs. Technological disruption consumes certain types of jobs. It creates other jobs elsewhere, but it's not that clean. Those other jobs could be in a different industry, in a different country, and certainly not the same skill set. There is horizontal displacement of jobs, whereas an accountant cannot become a software engineer in just 3 months because accounting was done. It was taken away by automation. Similarly, someone who was a laborer cannot become a software engineer either. In the United States right now, there are 6 million open positions that are unfilled, but there's also 3 million people long-term unemployed because there's a skill set mismatch. So these are the problems that policymakers are not able to figure out. Why? We have some solutions over here, but because it's a multifaceted issue, we have a lot of confusion around that. So these two charts. So remember what I said about accelerating economic growth, but here is a much more granular quarterly change in the United States. The upper chart in blue, that's nominal GDP per quarter. And see the trend line, most importantly. It's drifting downwards. Despite accelerating economic change worldwide, US nominal GDP drifting downwards. And nominal GDP is more important than real GDP because individual business decisions and corporate decisions are always...
That's growth, right?
Yeah, quarterly growth, yeah.
Per capita?
No, just percentage, nominal quarterly. Individual business decisions are never based on real GDP. When a corporation reports their earnings, they don't report two numbers, a pre-inflation, a post-inflation number. Nominal GDP is kind of the trajectory, the tailwind of what is the speed of the economy. And when it's too little, the bicycle gets kind of wobbly. That's why you have situations where a lot of the aspects of the technology industry are constrained. Nominal GDP being too low means you break even in a longer duration of time, and you have several other problems as a result. What used to be medium risk has become high risk. What used to be low risk has become medium risk. In the last 15 years, technologies that have very little upfront costs, such as apps and social media, have attracted more investment dollars, whereas the more expensive technologies, like space and electric cars, they're happening, but they're happening slower because of the large capex cost up front. Similar with jobs, you see how it mirrors the chart above. This is percentage change in jobs per year. In the 70s and 80s, you saw it was a higher trend, but there's just a general downward drift in the percentage of job growth per year because of nominal GDP. It's not correlated to real GDP. If you look at real GDP, you won't draw the connection. You look at nominal GDP and recognize that when inflation is too low, that constrains the entrepreneurship and that you would see, and therefore gets real GDP itself to be lower. That's the problem that we're facing. In the United States, 150 years ago, 70% of the people worked in agriculture, and they produced food, mostly for themselves and maybe for the other 30%. And now only 2% work in agriculture, and America produces a lot more food, too much food maybe. A country like India, you still have 70% of people working in agriculture, but very low-tech agriculture that way. That job transition happened, and all the farm hands were unemployed. They worked in manufacturing, so we survived that transition. The same thing happened in manufacturing, and it has caused a lot more angst because we hear about manufacturing jobs going away. The truth is, a lot of that's because of productivity gains and automation. US manufacturing dollar output never stopped going down. Never stopped going up, sorry. And each doubling time is shorter. In the boxes, you see 26 years, 21 years, and 13 years. So US dollar output of manufacturing never stopped going up, and it follows that same parabolic exponential curve. But jobs are fewer. And that's where the problem is, because, well, what are these people going to do? You can make all this output. What's going to happen? And now we're going to see the same thing in the service sector. Service sector is 85% of the workforce and 70% of GDP, but so many service jobs are going away. So what is the solution there? This is a chart from McKinsey & Company, artificial intelligence and jobs it would take away. Vertical axis is ability to automate in percentage, and horizontal axis is hourly wage. And okay, you see some jobs are very easy to transfer over to machines, and some are harder. But the way we think about it itself is wrong. The media will scare people, produce lists saying, these are the jobs going to be eliminated by artificial intelligence and robotics. And one, they never tell you the jobs that are going to be created. But more importantly, we have trained through our education system to make everyone kind of a conformist employee in most cases in the general economy. And the problem is, when someone sees a chart like this, they should think like an entrepreneur and say, well, these are the functions that can get done for free. Let's say an accountant is someone who is eliminated by automation and so on. And you have a department of 10 accountants that may have had payroll costs of, say, $3 million a year. If all that can be done by software for $100,000 a year, the employer can save $2.9 million. From $3 million down to $100,000, and move that into another area that's not automated, such as sales, or redistribute that to shareholders, and so on. that is how people should think. Very soon, there will be many other companies. In Silicon Valley, it's not as uncommon, but even more broadly. You will have companies that earn $10 million a year in revenue while having only 3 human employees, because the artificial intelligence is doing what might have taken 47 other employees. So $10 million a year, 3 employees, and that will be pretty common. That is already starting to happen, and very soon everyone will know someone who's in a situation like that. So we get to the other aspect of this. They talk about jobs being eliminated by automation. Well, if an upper middle class job is under a heavy tax rate, and what he quote unquote makes, 60% of that goes to him and 40% of that goes to the government. And if his job is automated, doesn't the government lose almost as much as the individual? So here's some data about tax rates by quintile. And as we know, people lower income, they withdraw more than they pay. Higher income, they pay more. Maybe this is fair, maybe it's not fair, but I contend this is the wrong framework to think about from this point onward, because we can now get to a much more modernized policy structure. We will have millions of high-paying jobs eliminated by automation. The government will lose all that tax revenue, in addition to the person not having employment opportunities. What if we could fix all of that based on the things that we've seen? Quantitative easing has to be permanent and exponentially rising. Jobs are going away from automation. We have too low nominal GDP, which restricts entrepreneurship because valuations of tech startups are much lower than they could be. And combining all of that, what if the solution is really a lot more simple and elegant than we may think? And I'll come back to that once we get to what is happening with taxation. Now, here's the problem when we talk about not only why quantitative easing was done, as well as tax-based erosion from artificial intelligence, attacking it from a million different sides. Here's the US deficit and surplus. And as we know, late 90s was a brief surplus because the stock market was rising, a lot of jobs, and a lot of capital gains. And then the other cycle top was 2007, and the other cycle top is arguably now. And then the red line is the troughs. Note how we're going to lower highs and lower lows. Isn't that kind of scary? Because the next recession, which may not be very far away, it may not even be years away, it's probably the starting point of that is probably just months away. How deep will that be? And the United States has accumulated a large national debt being the cumulative deficit. And if we're going to go to a deeper trough than last time, everything seems to indicate, because we're at a much lower point even at the cycle top, that's going to be catastrophic. Even worse, the quantitative easing they were doing before will not work this time because they've saturated the two instruments that they buy, mortgage-backed securities and treasuries. So it's not even the major market crash and recession decline that'll be the scary part. The scary part is that what they do won't work when they try to recover it. You won't have a V-shaped situation. And the policy recommendation that I'm going to get to after this are something they will have to try under duress. All of this is avoidable if they were to do this earlier, but as you know, it doesn't work that way. Governments will react quickly under duress, and usually after it's kind of late. Now, here's another problem. So over here we see budget surplus, budget deficit, what we spend in excess of taxes collected. But what is all our government taxation and spending does? Everyone here pays a lot of taxes because you're precisely in the bracket that they want to tax the most. The ultra wealthy have many ways to not pay, but the bottom 60 or 70% don't pay. So a narrow segment is bearing the brunt of all taxation. But how does spending even get dispersed? Look at how much has changed in America just in 50 years. Defense went down, okay? But payments to individuals, it's now 70% of all government federal spending. And if you include certain make-work jobs and things like that, it's probably 75 or 80%. 70% of all taxes paid are payments to individuals. Let's say 75%, taking a conservative assumption of make-work jobs. So 75% is just that type of transfer. And the bigger problem here is it's not only 75% of all spending, but since we spend more than taxes collected from the deficit we saw, it is 88% of all taxes collected. We shouldn't be spending more than taxes collected anyway, but if we only spend that much, it is 88% of all taxes collected. So this is a reason to be frustrated, like all the taxes that you pay is just a transfer payment and so on. We do it at a risk of a deficit that we're seeing, a deficit that will be much deeper during the next recession. And the mechanisms that got us out of the most recent recession will not even work this time. So isn't that kind of gloomy? What if we combined everything that we've seen in this presentation so far into a solution? Now, if you started this presentation at this point, this may look crazy. What if, who is this person saying we can get 0% income tax by 2025? But what if we could? And have a much better, more dynamic safety net than we currently have now. And that is the thesis of my publication that you can see online in chapters 9 and 10. So I contend that since most of our government spending is just transfers to individuals, QE has to be permanent and exponentially rising, and it can never stop. What if we embrace all of those realities and just say, well, fund these transfer payments with the QE? Since we know QE has to be done anyway, we know it can no longer be done in just treasuries and mortgage-backed securities. Fund all of these obligations, which are the majority of government spending anyway. It's politically impossible to reverse that. No one can reverse that, nor will they try to. Draw that connection directly. Replace it one for one in a very gradual transition. By doing this dollar for dollar replacement, you can start with something like Social Security, fund it with QE rather than with the payroll tax, a very regressive job-killing tax. And then you can gradually, in an orderly and phased-out way, get rid of various categories of income tax. Another important point about how we tax and spend. You know that 20% of all taxes paid are just wasted in the collection, auditing, and processing? People spend 6.6 billion hours just in doing their taxes. You pay money to TurboTax. You worry about an audit. There's something in your mailbox. Oh, I got a letter. I mean, that's 20%. Only in auditing, processing, and collecting. And that's the first half of the wastage. The second half is in disbursement. We maintain so many departments in Social Security, Medicare, and so on that there's so many people on payroll, so much fraud, so many non-overlapping aspects to these entitlement programs, different means testing, different qualifications, sometimes contradictory. There's many people who get unemployment compensation, but then when it ends, they can qualify for Medicare, Medicaid, and Medi-Cal, and they don't want to get a job because the first $20,000 would be consumed, and they would lose their very good health care under that. And all these very perverse and contradictory incentives exist. That's another 20% of wastage. So I claim that if this is what our culture has gotten towards, and the safety net is the majority of government spending, consolidate everything into a simple structure, and you save 40% right there. 40% of all government taxation and spending, which is a lot. And because the amount of QE that is done will be more than enough that's needed to fund all of these entitlement programs, you get to 0% income tax very soon. So this is a structure I describe in the publication. There's enough time to describe everything in detail over here. But if you embrace all these realities, this is what we talked about. We have tax revenue. We have spending in excess of tax revenue. That fat red arrow is the deficit. And then most of that is transfers between individuals. So almost all tax and spending transfer between individuals. And then in that separate box, we do that cloud of quantitative easing, very narrowly concentrated, not reaching the right place. It concentrates only in a couple of places, which are in the banking sector where people are closest to the spigot, and in some aspects of the technology sector, which benefits some of us, but it's really not benefiting the other 90% of people until we buy what they spent. It's very, very inefficient. You can call it pushing on a string or killing mosquitoes with a baseball bat or whatever analogy you want to use. That's how you can describe it. Instead, in the lower box, what if we did something so much more elegant and self-reinforcing? You took the quantitative easing we have to do in a country like the United States, give an equal amount to all US citizen adults. Don't do this means testing of is this person poor, this person rich, this person unemployed, and so on. Everyone gets the same amount. Whether young or old, rich or poor, male or female, lazy or industrious, no matter what you are. If you're an adult US citizen, you get the same proportion of that just to save the processing and means testing expenditure. In the process of doing that, you get rid of all these other programs that are non-overlapping. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, Affordable Care Act, other from the welfare, HUD, food stamps, everything just goes away into this universal stipend. You replace government spending, and because you're funding all of that with this QE that has to be done anyway, you can gradually and systematically phase out income taxes. And that can be done in a relatively short time. If we hypothetically were to start now, we could do it by 2025. It won't start that soon. It only start after there's a problem, and so on. And the thing is, since we saw that the world quantitative easing is rising exponentially, this universal stipend, basic income if you could call it that, I call it the direct universal exponential stipend, DUES, D-U-E-S. That can rise at 16 to 24% a year without causing inflation. It will start at a small base. The amount of QE needed in late 2016 to offset inflation would amount to maybe $400 per person per month. A small amount, but it would rise at 16 to 24% a year. A decade from now, that could be $25,000 a year. By the 2030s, it could be $100,000 a year. Sounds like a huge amount to be generating without inflation and without income tax, but it's just consistent with those earlier charts we saw about the centuries-long trend of exponential growth. And that brings us to what we see talked about a lot, we think about a lot, inequality. Now, what is inequality, and why does it exist? It's not what people think it is. People think in terms of dollars of income. Some of the media people who talk about this, they even conflate income and net worth, two different things. But when you talk about technology and futurism, the real inequality is one of era. It's safe to say most of us in this room, we're lucky to be alive now, because if we lived in the 19th or 18th century, you'd have to go to battle and fight, and none of us are probably good at that, and we'd be the first to die. And now we're in a high-paying set of careers, and we live in places where we have roof over our head, it's never too hot, never too cold, the food is really good. We're very fortunate to be alive now. But we're not the most fortunate. There's some people who have extracted modern opportunities to such an extent, their entire profession would not have existed. Like, take any professional athlete who not only earns millions for playing a game that until there was television, mostly only children played those games. Now adults play and get paid a lot of money. But they also earn endorsement fees. How can an athlete earn $40 million a year for endorsing a product that they don't use? Apparently the economy demands that, so that occurs. Same with tech billionaires. You can become a technology billionaire in this day and age because of those combination of opportunities that exist now. This chart is a poverty chart, very similar to the earlier charts we saw about exponential economic growth, but this is number of people living in absolute poverty. 1820, less than 200 years ago, within thousands of years of human history, a very, very small percentage of time. 95% of people in poverty. People like us would have to do hard labor, and we would be the worst people at that, probably, in that economy. It started to go down, and then it's gone down really fast. It's almost done. Most of the poverty loss in the last 30 or 40 years has been in China, as we saw from that chart on the map earlier. It's the greatest story of our time, for sure, that poverty reduction. And this number is almost zero now, living in absolute poverty. If the United Nations compiles poverty stats in UN Human Development Reports, if you look at the 1980 data and the people there, if the people compiling that data in 1980 were to see where we are in 2016, they would consider poverty to be eliminated. We don't see it that way today, but from their point of view, the progress made from just 1980 to 2016 would count as a victory. What was considered a first world country in 1980, more than half of the world population is above that cutoff now. Our expectations have risen and always will rise. But just on that metric, it would look from that point in time that we have, in fact, fixed what they consider to be the problem. And people say, okay, technological progress, a critic will always come over and say, yeah, but people don't eat computer chips and they don't eat their phone. And so technological progress improves only a small number of things. I say not true. These are charts from a blog from Professor Mark Perry that looks at a number of low-tech things that have also been optimized because technology was involved in their production process. So everything, these charts are in the publication, so you can look at these in more detail over there. Spending on food in the home, air travel, minutes of work required to drive a certain distance, all of this is becoming cheaper and cheaper. And we get used to this. Anyone old enough to remember cars in the 1980s knows how bad they were compared to cars of today. All the parking lots had rainbow little oil slicks in them, in all the parking spots. We don't have all that anymore. There's a huge improvement in just technological optimization of everything from food production, clothing production, transportation, everything. So that's why it's very fortunate that we are alive today. Think about how increased prosperity causes safety. All of us travel for business to countries that our country was at war with less than 100 years ago. Right? Now we just go there like it's nothing, and with the complete expectation they'll be safe, your credit card number won't be stolen, you won't be abducted or anything like that. This is a country that we were, in each case that we were at war with less than a century ago, millions of people died. Now business is conducted. And sometimes you don't have to travel. It's through conference calls and webcasts and things like that. All that is a huge, huge productivity gain. So the real inequality is not one of era, is not one of money or low income, high income, or income ratio. It's one of era. Because now there's more professions and more skill sets that can be monetized. There's a time when only 3 skill sets could be monetized. Like I said, people like us would have been very worse off. Now more and more skill sets can be monetized, new types of businesses everywhere in there. So that brings us back to why this would work very, very well. Because you increase economic activity in the process of eliminating income tax. You do the QE that has to be done anyway in a very diffuse, direct way. It creates a certain certainty. It's not just that people care about how much money they have or don't have. It's the uncertainty. If you know that your universal income can never be stopped, will never be garnished and is untaxable, your entire outlook becomes more stable. I would say a lot of petty property crimes will go down a lot because you know your next month's stipend is coming out. A lot of depressions and suicides would be a lot less because you know that you have a universal income that's rising 1 to 1.5% every month, 16 to 24% a year. You'd have 0% income tax, not only non-payment of it, but non-filing of it, almost as good. And incentives at work would also rise a lot because if you're getting a bonus, we're accustomed to getting a bonus and getting half of it, 55% of it maybe. What if you got 100% of it because you had no income tax? Wouldn't your behavior in the workplace change? Wouldn't the relationship between employer and employee change because there's not a middleman taking half of what should be a direct interaction? It's amazing what we accept because we're resigned to a certain fate. But I say taxing productive output to fund the safety net will soon be obsolete. It can be done in just a few years. And we'll wrap up this part very soon. The personal atom, accelerating technonomic medium, is something for everyone to think more about. There's so many opportunities of what you can optimize through technology and what is it enabled that no one, no matter how tech savvy they think they are, none of us is anywhere near even 50%. I'd say the average person is 10 to 20% utilization of the technological opportunities available to them. But no one is higher than 50%, no matter how much you want to be. And this is not just usage of devices and writing software code, but there's skill sets that were out of reach that are now attainable. Like you can learn how to become a very good cook just from YouTube now, which was not possible before. You can learn how to make a very high return on your investments by optimizing options and futures algorithms in a way that was not accessible to an individual before. Many, many types of businesses can be started by one person or a very small team that were not possible before. And the way you search for information is so much faster. You used to take a whole day to go to the public library and get the books you wanted. Maybe you don't even check out the right books. You have to go to and from. What if it's raining, snowing, whatever? It took a whole day. And then if you needed more books, you had to go back again. Now you do a Google search, and it's not only very fast, you can do it from home at 11 p.m. You don't care if the library is open or closed. If you can do continuous searches, and you save the transit time. And that same thing is being done for medicine, legal research, and so on. So the accessibility of information is so much higher. Only a small percentage of people are using that. Many people don't make use of the vast amount of information at their fingertips. But I give a lot of examples of how, and even some case studies and stories of how someone completely changed their life and found a new profession or business opportunity just from making use of technology that didn't exist before. And this, now we'll close with what is in the grand scheme what we want to do. Technological progress is rising exponentially, will become more prosperous. This helps many other areas, but includes space exploration and so on. And I contend that not only is that another frontier of technological innovation, asteroid mining, there's trillions of dollars in Earth prices of metals that are in near-Earth asteroids. Once we access those, the price on Earth will collapse of gold, platinum, everything. But even better, you can do satellites, 3D printing in space, and so on. But here's an exponential trend. There have been planets around other stars for many, many eons. We're only discovering them now because telescope power also progresses at a square root of Moore's law rate. So because it's an area-based thing, it rises 26% a year. And we didn't find any exoplanets, planets around other stars, until the 1990s. And that's one of the biggest and easiest ones to find. Now we're finding this at an exponential rate. 2014, another big block. 2016, even more. So we're finding thousands and thousands of these. This is a manifestation of technology beyond our own economy and our society. Our detection is rising. Our exploration of space will also rise exponentially because people may say, we put a man on the moon in 1969, then we stopped, so human space progress has stalled since that time. Not true at all. Our discovery is rising. And I contend humans aren't even the ones who should be in space. It's artificial intelligence, because an AI does not need air nor water. It can survive in a much wider range of temperature, pressure, gravity, and radiation than a human. Once artificial intelligence can be launched into space and be wirelessly upgraded both among themselves and from Earth, the net that we cast becomes a lot faster and speeds up our technological progress even on Earth. So we will be able to draw into the technological medium from beyond the Earth as well and push us forward in that regard. So this was a brief summary of the publication. I hope you can check out the URL and you'll see that. It's also in the notification sent out. But if you found this interesting, you can take a look at it and be in touch and see you out there. It's a campaign to try and get these government policies reformed and move us toward universal income, government efficiency, and removal of income tax. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's give him a hand. We have some questions for us. Let's have a seat and go over it. Thank you again for doing this research, and I think it's quite impressive that you're doing this research while working a full-time job, so that's just deserves a round of applause right there for doing that. But based upon what you're talking about, if we had to restructure our political policies, what would that mean for our current political parties?
Well, the political party that takes the most initiative in this regard will lock in advantages for many elections to come, but there's a huge opportunity of reorientation. I use a checkerboard analogy. In checkers, half of the squares are not even used, and in our current political landscape, half of policy positions are not even addressed. And it's not about left, right, or so on, because now we can say that there's a much higher safety net, a more dynamic and rising safety net possible, but with a lowering of tax. The path to a greater safety net always was assumed to be through a large tax increase. I say a lower tax rate is essential to that. So every orientation that we have and what we assume about the current political structure can change and completely reorient in a different direction. It's not clear which party would be the first to move in this direction.
Now, the Federal Reserve has a mandate to, raise or lower interest rates by buying treasuries or mortgage-backed securities. Do they have a mandate to start putting direct payments of transfers into people's bank accounts?
They can only do that after Congress authorizes an expansion of Federal Reserve powers. There's a lot of opposition to doing that because one, people fear that the Federal Reserve would be too powerful. There's also a fear that there's still a widespread belief that quantitative easing caused inflation, because until the late 20th century, that would have been true. But it has to be through a congressional authorization, and that won't happen until we're already in trouble and they fast track that.
So let's say the atom policies don't happen and we get put in a deflationary situation. What would that mean for our economy? And as an investor, what assets would you look to protect yourself from those negative effects?
So the consequences would be very severe because we have steered everyone into a lot of debt. Mortgage debt, student loan debt. And we still have a generation of economists that fear inflation more because they're from the 1970s. Whereas in a debt-heavy society, by far the scariest thing is deflation. And if we get into a deflationary spiral, it would be brutal just because there is a lot of debt that won't be paid, bankruptcies, and a cascade effect around that. And in the short term, it could be very, very problematic. Now, if any one large country figures out this situation, the amount of QE they do would bleed into others. So on the positive side, you don't necessarily have to have the US be the first one to figure it out. As long as one of them figures it out, then there's a workaround possible.
So you mentioned 2017, you see the effects of our current financial policies coming back to kind of hurt us. What signs will you be looking at to verify that this is going in line with what you're predicting in the atom?
So I would keep an eye on how much QE is being done. If it's not rising, and if it's staying flat, that means we're behind the trend line in that regard. And if we get behind the trend line by a certain amount, then the illiquidity is going to be a problem. That's one. The second is what we saw in our fiscal chart is, are we still running a deficit of -3%? And once that accumulates for so long, then the national debt becomes big enough that even a slight increase in treasury yield, which is what we've seen just in the last 3 or 4 weeks, becomes a problem. So that knocks another leg out from under the stool. And then there's other structural issues, such as the fact that the median baby boomer is now going to be 62 in 2017. They weren't 62 until that time. And the amount that they will require from Social Security and Medicare will be a lot more than has been to date, even though payments in are not rising. We talk about Social Security and Medicare solvency, but it still doesn't pay out that much because baby boomers are not the majority of retirees yet. When they are, those expenditures would balloon. And all that reaches a tipping point, which I say is only some months away. And by 2017, I mean the starting point. The actual bottom could be a little bit later, like 2018, but the starting point of a recession and the time by which one should be out of high-risk assets is 2017, so very, very soon.
As far as our careers, and I know there's probably a lot of students watching too and wondering if they should go to college the traditional way or maybe they should go through Coursera or whatnot. What are some steps people who've already graduated and people who haven't gone through college can do to make sure that they are in a position to do well in the age of the atom?
So it's very important to stay on top of what the technological trends are, but in terms of profession, there's only one profession that will never be obsolete and can always thrive, and that is the profession of a serial entrepreneur. Now, it's easy to say, think about being an entrepreneur. Not everyone is built for that. Not everyone is at a point in life to do that. But a young person should really think about going to places like Coursera and other online educational resources just to save the money and get earning a lot sooner, because then you aren't under this debt problem that we talk about. The other issue with that is the fields that are most suitable for propagating the atom are also the most easy to move to online learning. Like the Georgia Institute of Technology with AT&T now offers a Master's of Science in Computer Science for only $6,700 fully online. You don't have to relocate to Atlanta. They can take in not just 300 students like they would take in their brick and mortar program, but 10,000. So the field of study you can study that is most conducive to technological disruption is also the one that's the cheapest to learn, computer science. Now, I'm not saying everyone should be a computer scientist, but always think in terms of educational costs should be lower and embrace these newer platforms rather than rack up a huge amount of debt.
So you're going to work with the government, right? Like to get things to change? What do you think you can how you gonna proceed with that? Like,
Well, it's hard. I am a one-person campaign. I'm not connected to that, but one just has to persist and keep sending it to the right people and really claw one's way higher and higher up. It's an honor to present at this venue and get it to more people, and I would request that anyone who likes these ideas after reading the material send it upwards towards policymakers in government in both the US and elsewhere. And together, if more of us send it to more places, we will finally have some cracks in the dam and get these ideas looked at.
I have an online question. How do you expect society will handle the transition between a pre- and post-singularity world, the good, the bad, and the ugly?
So the singularity is a further out topic and a little bit beyond the scope of this. My estimation for a singularity is 2060 to 65. It's about 50 years from now, and you can see my details on the Atom website as well as the blog that I run, the Futurist. So that is so far away that the singularity by definition is something we as current humans will have difficulty comprehending, just like a non-sentient animal like a cat can't necessarily understand our technology. And by that definition, it is very difficult to even speculate that would be. But what I do think is possible is that once artificial intelligence can advance without any human assistance, that's quite a ways away, it's nowhere near that right now. When it can advance without human assistance, then technologies that improve human living standards may stagnate or slow down. We won't know the answer to that until the second half of this century, but we'll see.
What's the best argument you have heard against the atom thesis?
I haven't heard any very good arguments against it because most of the interaction is still just trying to get people to understand it well enough to debate it. But I would say the one area that I'd like to see more data on is I'd like to have a more accurate measurement of what the amount of QE being done in China is, because nobody knows exactly what it is. The charts that we saw includes Japan, Europe, and the US, but the China number is very difficult to measure, so it could be much higher or somewhat lower than we think, and that could introduce some uncertainty into the model.
Another online question. Your book predicts deflation will get worse as technological deflation to more of the, your book predicts deflation will get worse as technological deflation becomes more of a part of GDP. If deflation is dramatic, new products are free or near free, then won't that prevent new technologies from becoming a larger part of the GDP?
So that question has always come up, but that was also something that was thought of in the 1980s when the microprocessors and things were just starting to become a business. If the price is declining, how will we make money? The technology sector has done something very valuable for humanity, is to show how you can make a lot of money with deflating product prices. And whether it was Moore's Law covered chips from Intel or any of the technologies that Google produces or so on, as you sell more volume and create new business models, there's actually more wealth created from this reduction in input costs. So the financial principles that a tech company operates under can extend to the rest of the economy, is the way I'd put that.
Where can we find you online, and what else can we do to help you out so your word gets spread about your book?
So the URL was on the screen atom.singularity2050.com. And over there, I have ideas for volunteering that people can take up. And it could be anything, just sending it to the right people. I couldn't get that back on the screen, but atom.singularity2050.com. And I'm also going to be running a video contest, which will draw in a lot of young people to create videos to explain these ideas and concepts better. And that'll get a lot of visibility. And we're going to do some marketing and fundraising for that as well. And that's also a very high multiplier effect strategy. But just send it to relevant people, preferably send it upward to thought leaders and people in government, and eventually we'll break through.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us here at Google. We really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Yeah.